Bonjour. So I want to go through this grammar sheet looking at the present tense. So mostly we're going to focus today on the present tense conjugations. So you can see that here we have your regular verbs. So any of your regular verbs that end in ER would have these endings, the E, ES, E, ONS, EZ, ENT. Your regular IR verbs would have the IS, ISIT, ISSONS, ISSCZ, ISSENT. And your RE verbs, SS nothing, ONS, EZ, ENT. So we know that if it's a regular verb, it's easy to drop that ending and add one of these endings. That does not mean that irregular verbs are totally random. So that's what we're going to look at today is how can we find all of the patterns that make it easy to remember these conjugations and also to guess at new conjugations for verbs that you might not know already. It's going to help in that you don't have to remember 6 completely random words for each verb. Okay. So the stem changing verbs, these are regular ER verbs that just have a slight change, basically just for pronunciation for a lot of them. And they're minor spelling changes. So you can see that sometimes we have an accent. So for example, ashte, this E kind of doesn't have a sound to it, but we don't want to say just. And so therefore we add an accent to that E and it becomes jash et. And so that's the reason for that. If you wrote this achète without an accent, I would know what you meant. It wouldn't change or cause any confusion. But it is there. That's why it's there. Same with préféré accents, manger and commencer are because G and C both have 2 different sounds, just like in English. And so what happens is if we do not have an E after it, like in the new form with an ONS ending, technically we would pronounce it mangeant. And so we just add in an E because that way the pronunciation can stay mangeant. But same thing, it doesn't change comprehension or understanding of what you're communicating. That's just the reason why technically the correct spelling would have an E. And the essayer and appeler with doubling the L's, there are other verbs that double the L. Same thing for just pronunciation reasons. But the ones that we want to focus on are our irregular verbs. And again, you can see that we're going to be focusing on these patterns and things that we want that stand out that are different from the patterns. And that's what I've bolded. So anything that I've bolded like this, faites. Vous faites is probably the most irregular of the irregular conjugations. It doesn't follow any of the patterns. It doesn't end with an EZ like it's supposed to. Because if we go through, even in all of these irregular verbs, notice that every time we have a vous form, it ends with EZ. Okay, so if I gave you a new verb you've never seen before, and I asked you to conjugate it in the vous form, you could guess. You could take some part of that verb, add an EZ at the ending, and you might get it, or you might at least get pretty close. So you just have to remember vous faites. Verbs like vouloir and pouvoir break the pattern because of that EU spelling and also because of the X, right? So we can see again this SST pattern. So SST, 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 SST. Oops. And here with vouloir and pouvoir, it's X's. So we just remember that it's an X. And also the spelling of EU is different than the stem. But we can see that the stem and the nu and vous form usually match. So that's one thing that can help us as well. And then what we call the boot. So you might remember talking about the boot, which is our je, tu, il, and ils conjugations. Those look similar. But we can also group verbs because even with following those patterns, if we put vouloir and pouvoir together, we know that those conjugate pretty much the same. They follow the same pattern. It's just that vouloir has a V, pouvoir has a P. Être and avoir, again, are kind of irregulars. They don't closely follow our patterns, but we've been using those for a long time. You just have to practice them, and hopefully those are the ones that you're most familiar with. We can kind of remember vous êtes rhymes with vous faites to help us remember those ones. And also these first four have something in common, which is the eels form. So even though, again, we look at all of our eels forms and they end in ent, that's a standard just French verb ending for that eels else conjugation. And so we just remember that these four have that ont. So ils ont, ils vont, ils font, and ils sont. All those four rhyme, and they're all different than the rest of our verbs. A verb like prendre is almost a regular RE verb. It's so close. It's just that we drop the D in these plurals and we double the N. Now, again, this is one of those mistakes where if I said pendant, we might start to get some confusion because if I'm listening to you, I might hear that D, I might start to think of a different word. But something like with two N's versus one, I know what you're saying. I know what you're communicating. So some of these little spelling things and remembering are kind of what we might consider a minor mistake. They don't cause confusion and understanding. We have another pair, boire and devoir, that are the same, that they follow that pattern of an OI spelling. Boire has a BU, whereas devoir has a DE, but they also have that V. And the thing to remember with boire that I often see is that buvons, so we remember these U's, nous buvons, vous buvez, ils boivent, and the noun a drink is un boisson. And that gets confusing, so you just kind of want to remember that that is the thing, a drink, and it is not at all one of the conjugations. There are no S's in the conjugation of boire. Venir is kind of like prendre in that we have that double N. And we also, it's one of these boot verbs that in the boot we have that IE spelling, vient, 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 viennent. And in the nu and the vous, again, it copies the infinitive, and that we've seen in other verbs as well. And it keeps the VEN, venant, venez. Mettre also really wants to be a regular RE verb, and the only difference is that there's one T. And that's another one of those small little spelling things that you'll get used to the more you see it, but it doesn't change my comprehension. I know what you're talking about. So mettre and prendre are similar in that they're just so close to being regular RE verbs. Then we have sortir, partir, dormir, which you want to be IR verbs and unfortunately are irregular. And that is pretty common mistake as well. So you can see the je sors, je pars, je dors. They all put there together because they follow that same pattern. The SST, ONS, EZ, ENT, but they do not follow the pattern of an IR verb, which would have the IS, IS, IT ending. And again, just being familiar sometimes with that sound, listening to it. So like saying je sors is a pretty common thing to say, oh, I'm going out. So the more you practice, the more you use that, the more comfortable, and you'll recognize that that's je sors. Also something like je dors. We heard the je dors in that song that we did. So things like that to help you remember it and just practice it. Savoir and connaître are two verbs to know. So you know something or you know how to do something. So je sais que tu es gentil. I know that you're nice. Je connais Mr. Bauer. I know Mr. Bauer. I know him as a person. I'm familiar with him. So those are those differences in meanings. And again, they're following that pattern. SST, ONS, EZ, ENT. So even though it's an irregular verb, we can't simply drop an ending from my infinitive and add a set ending. It still follows the pattern of French verbs in general. And so we've talked, or I've mentioned a couple different things to help us get used to these. So you're just practicing them, you're using them as much as you can, and so then you're getting more used to them. You are thinking about the patterns. So knowing that if you need the to form of devoir, if you want to say you must, you're not just having to pull out a random word. There is sense to it, right? It is part of a pattern. So if we're kind of familiar with these conjugations, you know that the to form is going to end in an S, because most of your French verbs in the to form do. So you have those patterns. You have verbs that are similar, these families of verbs. So knowing like vouloir and pouvoir are the same, that can help you remember. And then just listening to them. The more that you listen to it, hearing it, and sometimes for other people, it might be helpful to write them out. So make sure that you're writing in sentences, not necessarily writing out conjugation charts, but just writing them and using them. Then you're going to see it more often and you're going to hear it more often. And that'll help you remember and use these. And I just want to then jump down. We'll talk about commands at a different time, and just talk about our future and recent past, which really has to do with having a conjugation plus an infinitive. And so that's what we want to be practicing as well. That idea of I like to eat, j'aime manger. I have to leave. So we have two verbs. I have to, devoir, and to leave. The first verb is conjugated. The second verb is in an infinitive. And that's how the future works as well. So I have to leave. Je dois partir. I conjugated je dois, and I left partir in the infinitive. So I'm going to eat. This is I'm going, and this is to eat. I conjugate one verb. The second verb is an infinitive. The recent past is a little bit trickier, so we'll do more with that later, but it's basically the same idea that we have a conjugation and the second verb is an infinitive. We just use the venir verb in French to translate as just doing something. If you think of it as I came from eating, that might help you a little bit understand that meaning of I just did it. So je viens de manger. So I just sang, je viens de chanter. I just watched TV, je viens de regarder la télé. Conjugated verb plus an infinitive. And some of that goes with, in our present tense, this idea in English of having a present that's ongoing. So the difference between, let's say, I drink milk, je bois du lait, and how that's different from I'm drinking milk. That I'm drinking and I drink have no difference in French. They both translate to the same thing, je bois. And so this comes up as an issue when you are trying to translate literally from English into French. And so you're thinking word for word, I am drinking. And so we want to start thinking a little bit differently about that verb and think about am drinking is really what that means is the verb to drink in the present tense, je bois. So I'm setting the table. I set the table every night. Both of those sentences, je mets. I'm sleeping, or versus I sleep in a twin-size bed, right? I sleep, I'm sleeping. They both are je dors. Okay, so just a little review of all of that. We have our verb conjugations, the regular verb conjugations, and our irregulars that we just want to think about the patterns, the SST, ONS, EZ, ENT pattern that applies to most verbs, or we can make a pretty good guess using that. And then for some of the specific verbs to get the spellings right, just remembering what's particular about them. And in general, just using them and listening to them as much as you can. You'll get more comfortable. And then the two important rules in general about using the present tense verbs is that if you have a conjugated verb in the present, like je vais or je viens or j'aime or je peux or je veux, whatever verb comes after it, we leave it in the infinitive. We do not conjugate two verbs together. And the last thing is that in the present tense, there is only one present tense in French. So I am eating, I eat. Both of those are je mange. Okay, merci.